madness, insanity. We use these words to describe what lies beyond our comprehension. Minds that have strayed from the common path. But have you ever wondered what madness truly tastes like? Does it have a sound? And can it, like an infectious disease, spread and take root within the very bricks and iron of a building? There are places in this world built with the noblest of intentions, to heal, to save, to bring lost souls back into the light. But within those walls, with the best of intentions, humanity often finds a way to create its own living hell. And when that hell finally closes its doors, it doesn't become empty. It simply waits for new guests. Welcome back to Midnight Tales. Tonight, we will pass through the rusted iron gates of one of America's most chilling and most profoundly haunted architectural marvels. A place that once stood as a beacon of hope, but ended as a monument to human suffering. This is the story of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, where patients were never truly cured, and where the souls never left. Brace yourselves. Tonight, we will listen to the screams that still echo through its desolate, abandoned halls. To understand the horrors of Trans-Allegheny, we must first understand the dream that gave it birth. In the mid-19th century, the treatment of mental illness was a nightmare. The afflicted were seen as demon-possessed or wild beasts, chained in dark, filthy dungeons, left to rot and die. But then a glimmer of hope emerged. Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride, a visionary reformer, proposed a revolutionary philosophy. He believed that mental illness could be cured, and his cure wasn't just medicine, it was architecture. The Kirkbride Plan posited that a serene, beautiful environment could soothe a fractured mind. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was the perfect embodiment of that dream. Construction began in 1858 in Weston, West Virginia, built entirely from hand-cut sandstone. It stands as the second largest hand-cut stone masonry building in the world, surpassed only by the Kremlin, with its unique bat-wing design, long, airy corridors, soaring ceilings, and thousands of windows. It was meticulously crafted to ensure every patient had access to what Kirkbride called healing light and air. It was designed not to be a prison, but a palace of healing, a true sanctuary for the mind. When the first patients arrived in 1864, they stepped into a world vastly different from the typical asylums of the era. Instead of the expected chains and perpetual darkness, they were given private rooms, affording them dignity and personal space. They had access to vast, beautiful gardens for therapeutic strolls and light labor. The treatment regimen was built on humane therapies, including occupational tasks and the soothing power of music. It was a radical departure from the norm, place where compassion was meant to be the primary medicine, a haven where truly broken minds could finally begin to mend. For a brief, shining period in its early history, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum seemed like a miracle materializing from stone and glass. It was the living proof of Dr. Kirkbride's humane philosophy, a testament to the belief that beauty and compassion could cure the deepest ailments of the human psyche. It stood as a beacon of progressive thought in a dark age of mental health treatment. But as with so many beautiful and ambitious dreams built by humankind, this idyllic vision of healing and hope was not destined to last. The shadows of a darker reality were already gathering at its gates. The first shadow to fall over Trans-Allegheny came not from within its walls, but from the brutal conflict of the American Civil War, before it could be fully completed and dedicated to its healing mission. The unfinished asylum was seized by Union forces. It was repurposed and utilized as a military outpost, a strategic post known as Camp Tyler. The long, sunlit halls, originally designed for the quiet recuperation of patients, were suddenly transformed. They now echoed with the heavy, rhythmic marching of soldiers' boots and the pained, desperate groans of men wounded in the throes of battle. The very grounds intended for peaceful gardens and quiet contemplation became stained with the tragedy of war. Blood was spilled on the soil and floors of this nascent sanctuary, planting the first deep seeds of violence and suffering into its very foundation. Long before the first mentally ill patient experienced trauma within its walls, the asylum was christened with the anguish of conflict. After the war concluded, the building finally reverted to its original purpose. But the scars of its military occupation, both physical and perhaps spiritual, remained ingrained in the very stone from which it was constructed, a dark prelude to the horrors yet to come. As America healed from its internal conflict, the nation itself was changing. Industrialization and urbanization led to a host of new and complex social problems. The purpose of Trans-Allegheny began to shift and expand in response. It started admitting not just individuals with genuine and severe mental illnesses, but a much broader spectrum of society's outcasts. The asylum became a catch-all institution for alcoholics, people with epilepsy, the homeless, and even, disturbingly, women who were deemed troublesome housewives by their families and communities. The criteria for admission grew perilously vague, turning the asylum into a convenient dumping ground. The gates of the asylum had been opened wide, not just to the mentally afflicted, but to anyone society deemed inconvenient or undesirable. a small trickle of human suffering and despair began to pour through its grand entrance. A slow but steady stream of individuals who were not sick, but simply unwanted. This marked a critical turning point in the asylum's history. The moment when its noble, therapeutic mission began to be corrupted by societal pressures. The focus slowly shifted from curing the ill to simply containing the marginalized, setting a dangerous precedent for the decades of overcrowding and neglect that would follow. By the 1950s, that initial trickle of patients had transformed into a horrifying deluge. The institution, meticulously designed by Dr. Kirkbride to comfortably house a maximum of 250 patients in private, sunlit rooms, was now crammed with an astonishing and unmanageable population of over 2,400 souls. The foundational dream of providing a serene and healing environment was not just compromised. It was completely and utterly dead. The very architectural principles that were meant to cure were now being used to facilitate a new kind of hell, one born from extreme and relentless overcrowding. The once spacious, sun-drenched corridors, designed to offer peace and fresh air, were now claustrophobic and chaotic. They were packed with row upon row of beds, placed side by side with no space between them, creating a maze of human misery. The private rooms, once the cornerstone of Kirkbride's philosophy of dignity, were now forced to house dozens of patients at a time. Privacy, a fundamental human need, ceased to exist entirely within the asylum's walls. The concept of a personal sanctuary was lost, replaced by an environment of constant, overwhelming, and stressful exposure to hundreds of other suffering individuals. As the patient population ballooned to nearly 10 times its intended capacity, sanitation became an impossible luxury. With overwhelmed staff and crumbling infrastructure, filth and squalor became the norm. The close quarters and unsanitary conditions created a perfect breeding ground for disease, which spread rampantly through the vulnerable patient population. Illnesses like tuberculosis and dysentery were common, adding a layer of physical suffering to the existing mental anguish. The grand building was no longer a hospital in any meaningful sense of the word. It was a powder keg of sickness and despair, waiting to explode. Trans-Allegheny had tragically ceased to be an asylum, a place of sanctuary and healing. It had devolved into a human warehouse, a grim repository where society discarded those individuals it wished not to see, think about, or care for. It was a holding pen for the forgotten, a place where people were sent to disappear from public view. The original mission of mending broken minds was a distant forgotten memory, replaced by the grim, daily reality of simply containing an ever-growing mass of human beings in the most basic and often most brutal way possible. As the patient numbers swelled uncontrollably, while the number of staff members remained dangerously low, the entire philosophy of care was forced to change. The pretense of humane, therapeutic treatment gave way to a desperate and often brutal system of control, with only a handful of attendants responsible for hundreds of patients. Individualized care was impossible. The staff, overworked, underpaid, and often untrained, resorted to primitive and violent methods to maintain order. Unmanageable patients were no longer seen as people in need of treatment. They were seen as problems that needed to be punished and subdued by any means necessary. A palpable miasma of despair, rage, and profound fear began to permeate the asylum, soaking into every hand-cut stone and iron bar of the building. The atmosphere became thick with the collective trauma of its thousands of residents. It was no longer a palace of healing, a beacon of hope on a hill. It had become a monstrous, self-perpetuating machine for devouring sanity. The very environment designed to cure was now actively contributing to the mental and emotional destruction of those trapped within it. The building itself seemed to groan under the weight of so much concentrated human suffering. Within this terrifying machine, the so-called cures administered to patients were often far more terrifying than the illnesses they were meant to treat. This marks the darkest chapter in the history of Trans-Allegheny. This is the point where the already blurred line between medicine and outright torture dissolved into complete and utter oblivion. Under the guise of medical science, procedures were carried out that inflicted unimaginable pain and psychological damage, leaving permanent scars on those who were forced to endure them. Assuming they survived at all, the quest for control had eclipsed the mission to heal. Hydrotherapy sounds benign, like a gentle spa treatment. But at Trans-Allegheny, it was often a form of water torture. In one version, patients were physically restrained and forcibly submerged in tubs filled with icy cold water for hours, sometimes even for days on end. They were left in the freezing water until their bodies turned blue and began to convulse violently from hypothermia. The supposed medical intent was to shock the nervous system into a state of calm. The frequent result, however, was not a cure, but severe pneumonia, shock, and often a slow and agonizing death. Another horrific form of hydrotherapy involved strapping patients into steam cabinets, which resembled upright metal coffins. Their bodies were enclosed, while their heads remained exposed. Superheated steam was then blasted onto their bodies, raising their body temperature to dangerous levels. This brutal procedure was intended to sweat out impurities and calm agitated patients, but it often resulted in severe burns, heat stroke, and cardiac arrest. It was a crude and dangerous practice that prioritized subjugation over any genuine therapeutic outcome. A clear example of the medical horrors that became routine within the asylum's walls. Electroshock therapy, or ECT, is a procedure that, in modern medicine, is carefully controlled and administered with anesthetic as a last resort treatment for severe depression. But in the mid-20th century at Trans-Allegheny, it was a brutal and primitive tool for control. High-voltage electrical currents were sent directly through the patient's brain without the use of anesthetic or muscle relaxants. This induced violent, uncontrolled grand mal seizures that were so powerful they could break bones, shatter teeth, and cause severe long-term memory loss and brain damage. It was a terrifying ordeal used to render difficult patients compliant. Seclusion was another common method of punishment and control for patients who were deemed uncooperative or dangerous. This was not simply placing someone in a quiet room. Patients were locked inside small, cramped metal cages, barely large enough to stand in, or they were chained directly to the walls of bare, solitary rooms. They were often left in total darkness, in their own accumulated filth, for days or even weeks at a time. This profound isolation and sensory deprivation was a form of psychological torture designed to break their will, often stripping them of their last vestiges of humanity. Yet nothing in the asylum's dark history can compare to the specific horror that unfolded on the building's infamous 4th floor. This was the epicenter of the most barbaric procedure ever disguised as medicine, the lobotomy. In the mid-20th century, a doctor named Walter Freeman championed and perfected this procedure into a quick, terrifying, and easily repeatable operation that he referred to as the ice pick lobotomy. He became a traveling evangelist for this procedure, leaving a trail of thousands of broken minds in his wake across the country. Imagine the scene. A patient, often without their consent, would be rendered unconscious, typically by administering a crude electric shock. Then Dr. Freeman would take a long, slender instrument that closely resembled a common ice pick. He would insert this sharp tool into the corner of the patient's eye socket, just above the eyeball, forcing it past the delicate tissues with a small surgical mallet. He would then hammer the pick through the thin layer of bone that separates the eye socket from the cranial cavity, driving it directly into the frontal lobe of the brain. Once the instrument had penetrated the brain, the procedure's most destructive phase began. Freeman would then swing the ice pick back and forth in a sweeping motion, much like a windshield wiper, indiscriminately severing the neural connections in the frontal lobe. This was the part of the brain responsible for personality, emotion, and higher reasoning. The entire grotesque procedure, from start to finish, took only a matter of minutes. Freeman boasted of his speed and efficiency, viewing the brain as a simple organ that could be easily altered with a few swift movements. Dr. Freeman traveled the country like a macabre showman, performing thousands of these lobotomies, and he was a frequent visitor to the overcrowded Trans-Allegheny Asylum. It is estimated that hundreds, if not thousands, of patients within these walls suffered this horrific procedure at his hands. The result was never a cure. The result was the annihilation of the self. Patients who underwent the procedure often became docile and compliant, but they also lost all capacity for emotion, all of their memories, and everything that constituted their unique personality. They became empty, living shells. The fourth floor, the ward where these lobotomies were most frequently performed, became a place of profound and dead silence. It was a ward filled not with the sounds of recovery, but with the eerie quiet of extinguished souls. It became a place where a person's spirit was surgically stolen, even as their body was forced to live on in a state of passive emptiness. The intense psychic trauma and spiritual violence enacted in this specific part of the asylum left a deep and permanent stain, one that many believe can still be felt today. When the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum finally and permanently closed its doors to the public in 1994, it released its last living patients back into the world, but it could not release the dead. According to countless paranormal investigators, former staff, and visitors, the souls of those who died within its walls, trapped by unimaginable pain, rage, and madness, remained behind. The building was no longer a hospital, but it had become a permanent residence for the spirits who had nowhere else to go. Their stories forever bound to the decaying stone. One of the most famous and tragic spirits said to reside here is a young girl named Lily. The historical records of her time at the asylum are unclear. No one is certain how she arrived or the circumstances of her death. Her innocent spirit, however, is said to linger in the old children's ward on the second floor. Visitors often report hearing the disembodied sound of a child's giggling, or the distinct noise of a small ball rolling and bouncing across the empty wooden floor. Lily is not a frightening spirit. She is simply a lonely child, eternally searching for her mother or a playmate. The first floor is believed to be the domain of a far angrier and more confrontational spirit. This entity is known as Ruthie, who is thought to have been a patient who suffered horrific and repeated abuse at the hands of male staff members during her confinement. In death, her spirit is said to harbor a deep and violent hatred for men. Male visitors and paranormal investigators frequently report unsettling and aggressive physical encounters in this area, such as being shoved or scratched by an unseen force, or hearing a guttural, disembodied female voice muttering curses and warnings in the dark. The asylum's Civil War section is haunted by another prominent spirit, a large and imposing soldier named Jim. His presence is often felt not through direct interaction, but as a massive, intimidating shadow that moves on its own, or as a menacing and overwhelming sense of being watched by an unseen, hostile presence. His energy is heavy and oppressive, a lingering remnant of the building's first chapter of violence and bloodshed. A soldier who never left his post, he serves as a constant reminder that the building's history of tragedy began long before it became an asylum. Perhaps the most disturbing and unsettling apparition reported at Trans-Allegheny is that of an entity known only as the Creeper. It is most often witnessed on the dreaded fourth floor, the very place where the lobotomies took place. It is described not as a human figure, but as a dark, inhuman shadow, moving by scuttling rapidly across the floors and up the walls with an unnatural, insect-like speed. No one knows what it is. Is it the tormented spirit of a patient who completely lost their humanity? Or is it a demonic entity drawn to the intense suffering of this place? These named spirits, along with hundreds of other nameless souls, have transformed Trans-Allegheny into a veritable community of the dead. They are said to walk the long, decaying halls, sit silently in the old, rusted cells, and fill the air with their phantom sobs and screams. They are the permanent residents of a building that held them captive in life and now refuses to release them in death. They wait, trapped in an endless loop of their past trauma, for something or someone that will never arrive to save them. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum stands today as a massive, silent monument carved from stone, a testament to a century of human tragedy. It serves as a stark and chilling reminder that the road to hell is sometimes, and perhaps most frighteningly, paved with the very best of intentions. The noble dream of healing and compassion that laid its first stone ultimately crumbled under the weight of neglect, cruelty, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the human mind, creating a legacy of suffering rather than solace. The Kirkbride dream of healing died within these walls a long, long time ago, but the horrors that it inadvertently unleashed continue to live on. They are not just present in the reported sightings of ghosts or the disembodied voices caught on recorders. They exist in the very atmosphere of the place. Visitors consistently report a profound and suffocating sadness, a heavy, tangible despair, and a sense of physical and spiritual confinement that transcends the mere presence of walls and locked doors. The pain is a part of the building itself. When you finally step out of its rusted iron gates and back into the world of the sane, a powerful realization dawns on you. You realize you haven't just visited a historical landmark or a creepy abandoned building. You have emerged from a place where the spirits and sanity of thousands of human souls were systematically crushed and destroyed. You leave a piece of yourself behind in that heavy atmosphere, and you take a piece of its profound sorrow with you, a chilling souvenir of your time spent with the forgotten. And their screams, though long silenced by time and death, still echo through the asylum. If you listen closely, in the mournful whistle of the wind that rattles through thousands of broken window panes, you can still hear them. They are the desperate, eternal cries of the confined, the lost, the broken. They are the final testament of the souls who never truly left. Thank you for joining Midnight Tales on this chilling journey into one of America's most haunted locations. What do you believe turned Trans-Allegheny into such a hotbed of paranormal activity? Was it the immense pain and torture suffered by the patients? Or do you think the building itself developed a sinister spirit over time? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. We want to hear what you think about this dark and tragic place. And if you are fascinated by the intersection of dark history and supernatural mysteries, be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss our next dive into the world of the unexplained, where we explore the stories that lurk in the shadows of our world. Until next time, be grateful for your sanity and for the freedom that so many within these walls were denied.